Hey everyone, and welcome back to What's the Plan, the podcast where we dive into the matters of our careers in the architecture and urban planning field. I'm Hayley.
And I'm Andrea. So, Hayley, what's the plan this week?
This week's plan is all about affordable housing.
Yeah. With the pandemic, a lot of people are spending more time at home and therefore reevaluating their home needs. So, whether that is needing more space or wanting to relocate to a neighborhood for certain amenities such as like parks or even just to be closer to family.
Mm-hmm.
Coupled with lower interest rates or financing, there are a lot more interest, thus leading to a housing crisis.
That doesn't sound good.
Not at all. So, the housing crisis is currently created because there is a population growth that outpaces the building growth. So, not only are we not building in places where people want to live due to zoning restrictions, but also there is a constraint in supply. And also, at the same time, less people are wanting to sell their homes due to COVID. You don't want to have like open houses. You don't want to invite outside people to look at your house. So a lot of people are just waiting and holding on to their homes until after the pandemic is over. And at the same time, more people are entering the market, such as millennials. They've reached that life stage where they finally have enough money saved up to afford a mortgage and buy a house. And in addition to that, as construction and developers are trying to keep up with supply of housing, there is a lack of supply of lumber to actually build these houses. And it's gone so crazy that like the cost of lumber itself, typically a lot of construction or developers and contractors, they use the term like 1,000 board foot to describe like how much it costs for lumber. That price itself has increased 3 times within the past year. And this is due to like multiple reasons that are a lot of times out of our control. So the first one is there's a lot of beetles in Canada specifically where a lot of lumber and pine is created, where that these beetles are attaching to these pine trees and therefore like destroying a lot of trees that typically are available to turn into lumber. And as well, a lot of people are at home, they're bored, and they just want to, I don't know, spruce up their backyard. So there's a lot more people looking for lumber to make DIY projects.
Oh my goodness, that's so funny. Like,
Yeah, so it's like there's just like a lot of things happening at once to kind of contribute to the lack of lumber supply. So if you wanted to build a deck or if you've been looking into building a deck or a shed for your house or for your backyard, you've noticed like the price of lumber has increased. If
yeah.
not just that, but like there's nothing left at Home Depot.
Yeah, I've noticed wood prices have gone up a lot, but I never would have guessed that beetles would be the like I mean, it makes sense now that I
Yeah.
hear it, but I never would have guessed that the reason why wood is so scarce right now is because beetles are
The Beatles,
eating
yeah.
it.
Yeah, and
Wow.
like a lot of the reason why there's a lot more beetles that are
Mm-hmm.
damaging these pine trees are is because of climate change.
Oh, that makes sense. That makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah. Yeah, so like taking all these factors into consideration and like putting them all together, uh it is like no reason or very obvious why their housing prices continue to soar. And
Mm-hmm.
like it doesn't help that like people that who are able to afford these houses are often overbidding to be competitive and thus like driving up prices. Like even though they can't afford it, they or even though they don't want to overbid, but they know that like we need this house and everyone else wants this house, and in order to kind of win like the highest bid or the best bid, you often want to have the highest price.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like by doing that, like you're not only increasing how much you're going to pay, but like everyone else is doing that, and then just the overall price of housing is going up.
Mm-hmm. And with that, I think you know how recently, I think within the past month or two, like there were
Yeah.
so many houses in Toronto that were sold at least what like 400,000 over asking. And that is
Mm-hmm.
just crazy to me. Like not
Yeah.
only do people overbid for housing, but people
Mm-hmm.
who are selling their houses put their prices at such a low base point that they
Mm-hmm.
because they want the bidding wars to happen, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just like the amount of overvaluing of homes in Toronto is
Yeah.
so upsetting.
Yeah, no, actually this past couple of months there was a house like on my street that was for sale. And the I think the opening price was like 1.2 million dollars, but it ended up going for sale like getting sold at 1.4 million dollars.
Oh my
So
goodness.
it's like Why? How? Like, it's just wild to see how much, like, discrepancy between the sale price and the sold price.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's...
Yeah. And, like, not only are people overbidding, we kind of mentioned this on, like, our previous episode, like, when we talked about success, but, like, the mentality a lot of people have towards housing is not only as, like, housing as a necessity, but also as an investment. Or, like, rather than, like, being a basic necessity, it is an investment. And therefore, these people that are able to afford multiple properties are just holding all these properties and just, like, decreasing the supply for everybody in general.
Yes, I have a few words to say about that later on in the episode.
Yeah, so, like, the same thing that is happening to buyers is also happening to renters. Although, according to Future Model Toronto, Toronto is North America's fastest growing city and currently has a record number of high-rises in development, with over 100 buildings over, like, 100 meters tall under construction, and with 300 plus buildings over 100 meters tall proposed. A large number of these developments, many which consist of housing, are actually not a lot of them consisting of affordable housing, which is a problem. So, what is affordable housing? In Canada, according to the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, or CMHC as some people know it, it states that housing is considered affordable if it costs less than 30% of a household before tax income. As for the Ontario Human Rights Commission is a bit more flexible or in terms of their definition, and they uses a range of 25 to 35% before tax income. So now that we know that, let's take a look what's out there in Toronto. So Hayley, although you have never lived in Toronto, the rental market I think in Waterloo is quite surprisingly like comparable to Toronto. So let's play a game.
Okay.
What do you think the average rent of a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto is?
Okay, so let me think about Waterloo prices, going back to when I lived there, when I was trying to look for a place. You know what? Before I answer that, I just want to say,
Yeah.
oh man, maybe one day we should talk about the housing prices in Waterloo, because that
Yes.
why are apartment units in Waterloo so ridiculously high for such a small town? Anyway, I digress. Going back to the question. Average rental price for a 1-bedroom in Toronto. I'm gonna say 1.5K.
Ooh. A little north. So the average rent price it's north of the answer. I mean, south of the answer, that's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, so it's more than 1.5K?
Yeah. So the average rent of a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto currently is 1.8K.
Oh.
And in order for that to be affordable, your hourly wage needs to be $31.45. And as you and I know, that is way more than what an average person makes. So now that you have like kind of a base point for a 1-bedroom, what do you think the average for a 2-bedroom is?
Okay, so about 1.8 for a 1-bedroom.
Yes.
So adding another bedroom to 1.8K, it shouldn't cost double of that, because you don't get 2 kitchens with that. You don't get the 2 times the amounts of bathrooms and other stuff. So let me think. 1.8. Let me divide that by 3, so around 6. What's 1.8 plus 6? That's
2.4.
2.4. I'm gonna say around 2.4K.
Bingo.
Wow, look at me go. My guessing is so on point.
Yeah, so the average rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Toronto is currently at $2,407.
Wow. Okay, before you explain that, I just want to say my guessing was purely based on the math behind it and not
the size of a unit.
Like I'm not thinking about the unit, like what it should be worth. I'm just like guessing based on the math. But if I were to guess based on the worth of a 2-bedroom unit, I would not have guessed that high.
Yeah, so in order for a two-bedroom apartment to be affordable, you would have to make $42.32 an hour.
That's so
And
upsetting.
like based on my current position or my current role for a job, this two-bedroom apartment would not be affordable for me unless I'm like 5-10 years into my career.
And even if we divide the two bedroom by two, so it's like, if you have two bedrooms, maybe you have a roommate, that's like $20 an hour. That's minimum wage is nowhere close to that. So,
Yeah, we'll touch about, yeah. So, like, now that we have that, talk
Mhm.
about rent, what do you think of the average cost for a single family home is? So, single family home is like detached home with probably like 3 to 4 bedrooms.
I don't even want to think about that. In Toronto,
Yes. Or this is the Greater Toronto area.
oh man, so you're putting like York region into that too. I feel like that's
York
going to
Region, Peel, all that, yeah.
mm,
Anything in the Greater Toronto area.
I'm going to guess it's definitely in the millions. I'm okay, I'm gonna be conservative and say 1.1 million.
Close. So, as of February 2021, the average cost of a single family home is $1,045,000.
Okay, you know
Which is,
what? That is less than I was expecting.
however, although
Oh,
it's less than what you're expecting,
mm-hmm.
it actually has gone up 14.9% from 2002. I mean, 2020, my bad. It has gone up over 100K within a year.
Yeah,
And
that's a lot.
yeah. And based on the median household rate, according to Better Dwelling, they have found that it would take an average 25 years for a family to save for a down payment of a house of that price. A down payment.
Oh, so like maybe typically families start looking for houses, like start moving into their own place at like 25, mid 20s. You add another 25 to that before they can afford to own a house. That's 50.
Yeah, so like by the time you can afford a house, you can probably look for a smaller house because if you do have kids, your kids will be out of the house.
Wow. Or you know what? Maybe you can even start looking at retirement communities. Like,
Exactly.
you're not even gonna need a house anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and like now that we kind of like heard about all these figures are for like housing costs, renting costing, it's like you keep this in mind, like the minimum wage in Toronto is $14.25 per hour. And according to a lot of sources, the livable wage is $22.08 per hour. So with those prices or with those wages that you're giving out to people, housing will never be affordable.
Sad. Sad.
Yeah, that's sad. Yeah. And this issue is not only isolated to Toronto, but also across the country and around the world. In fact, Toronto only places second in Canada following Vancouver and seventh in the world behind 6 other cities in most unaffordable housing market.
Wow. Okay, so with that little bit of context that you guys just heard,
Yes.
and the amount of emotions we both had in that like few minutes of this episode, you can tell why we're like we want to talk about affordable housing. And so with this, we want to talk about why it's important to have affordable housing. So based on everything that we just said, first and foremost, housing as a whole, which on a broader level is just basic shelter, is a necessity for survival. Like, everyone knows that. We talk about not only the survival of humans, just animals in general. Survival is one of the basic needs. So, of course, for human life, housing is just so important. And now, when we say affordable housing, many people automatically tend to think of rental housing that is subsidized by the government. But in reality, affordable housing is a very broad spectrum that can include housing provided by the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. So, as Andrea mentioned earlier, in Canada, housing is considered affordable if it costs less than 30% of a household's before tax income. And that's not the case for a lot of Canadians, especially in the Toronto context, that is very far from being a regular and normal occurrence. So, not only is affordable housing important to the economic vitality of communities, but affordable housing contributes to personal well-being. And if you're having trouble understanding why affordable housing leads to personal well-being, let's think about it this way. Having affordable housing also means reliable housing, in that you don't have to worry about whether or not you will be able to afford rent next month, which means that there is a huge relief of stress. When housing only costs 30% of a household's income, there is now so much more of that income that households can use to focus on other necessities, such as food, and so now the battle of choosing between rent or food no longer needs to happen. And honestly, that makes me really happy. Like, I wish that it wasn't the case to begin with, but whenever I hear stories of people who are thinking, or who have said, oh man, I slept for dinner last night because I need to save up to pay rent next month. Like, I'm fortunate enough to never have been in that situation, but I don't understand. Like, every part of me wants to fight everyone who let this happen, because
it's inhumane.
Exactly. Like, why is this so common? When I read posts like that, there's always people responding and saying, oh, me too, or like, this is what I do instead, or this is how I cope with the situation. But this shouldn't be a situation that is so common, that people have come up with little tricks and tips to help get by because they need to choose between rent and other basic necessities. But anyway, on an economic level, affordable homes can also attract and retain employees to the different communities and different areas, which means that more businesses can thrive. So affordable housing should also be looked as beneficial in an economical standpoint for, let's say, governments and different cities, towns, just overall communities. And honestly, they should implement more affordable housing policies, because it'll attract so many more different workers from all different walks of life and all different stages of life. And when you're able to attract different people to want to work in your specific community or town or wherever it is that you are, just think about how much your economy can bloom with that. So, you know, I don't see any cons to implementing affordable housing at this point, and I don't think I ever will. But, you know, if you want to try to fight that, if you want to play devil's advocate, I would love to hear any points you have on that.
For sure. And it's like, not only we're talking about like basic necessities, but we're also talking about like achieving a certain quality of life. Like, you shouldn't be a good quality of life is you have, like, you're comfortable in your shelter, you have comfortable food, you have access to water, and like all your basic necessities. So it's like, if you don't even have one of the basic pillars of it, you'll never have a good quality of life, and it's gonna be really hard to establish other aspects of that.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to note that affordable housing doesn't only mean like you can pay for rent, but it also means being able to afford the utilities such as like electricity, heat, air conditioning if it gets like super hot in the summer. Being able to afford that without being hesitant on whether or not you can afford the other aspects of your life is what it means to have affordable housing. And so, with all of that being said, when affordable housing becomes a regulated policy, the amount of quote unquote low income communities and the implicit bias that comes with living in these communities will be reduced because affordable housing will be, it can be found anywhere. And so these individuals who couldn't afford to live in specific areas in the past, they no longer feel segregated and they don't need to feel exiled because they don't fit into a certain area.
So, that in mind, we're going to talk about some examples. And to very little surprise, Hong Kong has the most expensive housing market in the world. And over the last 12 years, properties in Hong Kong have more than tripled in value. And today, on average, an average Hong Konger would need to save their full salary for 20 years in order to buy a home. Their full salaries. Not even before tax income things we were talking about previously, but their full salaries. And yes. And when comparing it to other major cities, the average rent of in Hong Kong is nearly twice of London. And residents pay almost 4 times as much as rent as New Yorkers do for nearly half the average living space per person. So in New York, you would probably pay say 4K for a space that is maybe not 4K, maybe 2K for a space that is 393 square foot. But if you're in Hong Kong, you would get that same amount of, you would only get 101 square foot in proportion. So it's you're living in a much smaller space. And therefore, you end up with many conditions called coffin homes. And these are 30 square foot subdivided apartments, subdivided illegally, as I should add on, for those having, and for those having trouble figuring out what 30 square foot is, and that is 1/4 the size of a parking space. So take your average car park and you chop that into 4 bits. You only have that one corner. That is the size of your coffin home.
Basically half of a car.
Not even a quarter of a car.
Oh my goodness.
So the question is, how did Hong Kong end up here? And contrary to popular belief, the problem isn't land scarcity, but actually land use. And can you take a guess what's the percentage of land in Hong Kong that is actually developed? Take a wild guess, any number.
I'm going to say. What was the question?
So,
how much of Hong Kong has been developed?
Yeah, what's the percentage of the land you think that has been developed in Hong Kong, based on your background knowledge of either being there or seeing photos and visuals of their apartments? Yeah.
So what I do know about Hong Kong is that there are villagey areas where there are really big farmlands. Houses are very far apart and you have to do a lot of walking to get from one house to another. But obviously the city, the downtown core of Hong Kong, is the most dense and claustrophobic thing I have ever been in. So, in my mind, trying to balance all of this out.
How much green space there is to built environment?
I'm going to say 30%.
Ooh, okay, good guess. So, actually, less than 25% of the land in Hong Kong is actually developed.
Oh.
And within that 25%, less than 3.7% is zoned for high density living.
Oh.
Which contributes to the lack of housing. And as for why the reason for the lack of development, it's actually rooted in Hong Kong's colonial past. And even know, but many people know the city was designed to be a low-tax, business-friendly hub that still continues today, as it exists as a special administrative region, or SAR, as some people know. And this designation allows it to continue to prosper for money reasons, and it's also why Hong Kong has a separate economic system than mainland China. And until 1947, only expats were allowed to live on Hong Kong Island. So that basically relegated all of the Chinese-born Hong Kong people to live within the mainland in a small area. And although the island is no longer reserved for the British and is owned by the government today, it is predominantly taken over by wealthy business personnel for private use, as the government sells long-term leases through auctions. So, once again, showcasing how the real estate is only a commodity for the rich.
How fun.
Mm-hmm. So what
we agree wholeheartedly.
Yes. So what are they doing to solve this scarcity problem? Many people have proposed creating development on the brownfield lands in the northern parts of New Territories, where it's currently mostly rural or park spaces or parkland. And although the government is in the process of executing such a proposal, very few of these sites will actually be dedicated for public housing, which is known as affordable housing in Hong Kong. And instead, the government has proposed a series of artificial islands off the shore of Lantau Island called Lantau Tomorrow Vision. And for those unfamiliar where Lantau Island is, this is where the airport is located, the Big Buddha is located, and where Disneyland is located. So that area is quite like sparse and like spread out, and there's not a lot of people actually living there. And
so is it like a more touristy area, you would say?
For sure. Like people that go to Lantau Island go there for specific reasons often. So they either like go there for tourism or like they're going there just to get to the airport. So it's more so like a place of just passage and not a lot of long-term development or people living there. So so the idea for them is like to just like infill their sea and their shore and to like have little islands and to build apartments there for housing, which a lot of people have questioned because like you're not located to a lot of other existing infrastructure, so it's like you're just kind of once again like isolating people in the middle of nowhere. So as we know, Hong Kong has a lot of problems with affordable housing, and this especially in the supply of it. Although they are lacking in supply, they do have a lot of different public housing programs that are quite innovative in a way to allow people to afford affordable housing. And I'm just going to run through some of the examples. And the first one is a public rental housing, which is rented at discount rates to low-income residents. There is something called a home ownership scheme, which allows for a subsidized sale of public housing estates for low-income residents. There is a tenants purchase scheme, which allows for existing tenants in their rented public housing estates to actually purchase their units. There is a flat first sale scheme, which is for apartments for sale at lower price for certain people. So whether you are of a certain demographic or you're a certain income class, there is a specific percentage that you pay less than certain other people. And there is something that I've never really heard before, but it's called a sandwich class housing scheme.
Yeah, I love that name.
Yeah, so it's built for sale to lower middle income residents who do not qualify for low income public housing in the home ownership scheme, but still have trouble affording private housing, which is quite unique because I don't think a lot of other countries have this for people that are like they don't fall in low income and they don't fall in like regular like middle class. And then there's also interim housing, which is temporary public rental housing for those who are waiting to be placed into public housing estates or not immediately eligible for flats in the public housing estates, and something called a green form subsidized housing ownership pilot scheme, which is exclusively catered for green form applicants. So like there's apparently two ways of applying for affordable housing, which is one's using a white form and one's with a green form, and the green form one you apparently have your own way of affording a house, which is quite weird or quite like unique in a sense that I've never seen that in other places. But like despite all their different like schemes and pilots to get people into affordable housing without like a sufficient supply, many people are on the program waiting list for several years, and in some cases some people are on these waiting lists for 20 years.
Okay, I just need to go back to that green form for a second.
Yeah.
So, do applicants get to choose which form they get, or are they just handed like at a lottery system? You get a green form.
It's more so based on your background. So like what your current job is, your income rates, and a lot of that kind of stuff. And then they would give you like a special green form that like it's like unique to certain situations. but I'm not sure exactly why
Okay.
they singled those out. So it's quite for me, it's unclear. But there is a pilot program of such that exists.
Right. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
it's not like, oh, which one do you get today?
No,
You
you don't
get
get
the
to
green
pick.
one.
It's more so they decide based
Okay.
on your background. Yeah.
So if you're eligible for the green one, you're not for the white one.
Yes.
Okay, okay, that
Yes.
that makes a
Yes.
little more
It's
sense.
so
Still
it's yeah.
confusing, but it
Yeah.
makes a little more sense.
Yeah.
But now let's address the real question of having to wait 20 years
Yeah.
on the wait list.
Mm-hmm. That's why a lot of
I
people
am
end up
literally
in
speechless.
yeah, that's why a lot of people end up in coffin homes because they're kind of left with no choice. They have some money, but not enough money to get where they want to be, and without supply, like without enough units in Hong Kong, you'll never like be able to slot everyone into a spot if there's no new builds.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I think I want to give our listeners a little bit of context
Mhm.
on what living in a coffin home would actually be like. So I've seen like clips and videos of
Mhm.
people who live in super small areas or super small homes
Mhm.
and in a Hong Kong context, and correct me if I'm wrong, but are these coffin homes so small that people who live in these homes, they they rely on takeout for all their meals because they don't even have kitchens?
Yeah, so how these coffin homes work is like one apartment is like subsidized. Like, they like the landlord, whoever owns a place, would like sort of build boxes of like 12 little rooms, and you would all share one kitchen and potentially one bathroom. So there is no space within your coffin home to cook unless you have like one of those like butans, one of those like hot pot stoves or something like that with butane, yeah, butane stoves. So like a lot of times they do rely on like takeout or like in Hong Kong it's like rice boxes that you would buy at a deli or a restaurant. So a lot of times they would rely on that. And within these coffin homes, because it's so small, most of the time to take advantage of space, they would have a bunk bed. So they would try to maximize their vertical space, but sometimes even
Mm-hmm.
that is quite limited. And in some cases, there was a video of a guy that was trying to showing around his coffin home to a journalist, and he was saying how the current coffin home that he lives is quite spacious because he's able to actually stand up and walk around within his coffin home, whereas in his previous coffin home all he could do was just lie in his bed because there was no physical floor space for him to move, in addition to his like bed and his like drawers for his clothing and his like belongings. So it's a really big problem, and it's important that Hong Kong addresses these problems fast and they actually start to
Mm-hmm.
build more development, because a lot of people don't have time to wait. They don't have time. They don't have 20 years to wait just to get housing. And it's not a
Mm-hmm.
good quality of life for everyone to be living in these tiny boxes for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, I think like the amount of subsidization that the government has for housing in
Mm-hmm.
Hong Kong, you would think that they would be able to divert some of that money into more development
Mm-hmm.
or something like that, better development programs, or just divert that money in a way to actually help the residents
Mm-hmm.
be able to have space and living space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something that they need to think about, or they should think about, because I think that's a possibility if they actually want to
Mm-hmm.
get to that point.
And considering that they're making a lot of money off of selling like land in Hong Kong Island to like wealthy moguls, it's like where is that money
Mm-hmm.
going to? Why can it not go back to creating housing for people that need it?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow. That is very upsetting.
That is.
Wow.
Mhm.
So now going back to the Canadian context, the Toronto real estate market surged back in February of this year, so just a few months ago, and the average price of a Toronto house has just surpassed the $1 million for the first time ever. There was a 5% increase in home sales in 2021 compared to what the home sales number was in 2020. And on top of that, like Andrea mentioned earlier, the average selling price was up 14.9%. So again, that is a big jump in home prices in just 1 year. And so now let's talk about why this is happening. Why has Toronto housing become such a crisis? The large and most all-encompassing answer is that demand level is at an all-time high and the inventory is just very low. So there just isn't enough housing to keep up with the demand, which ultimately put Toronto in what some people would call a housing bubble. A housing bubble is a temporary event, but temporary can mean several years, where homes are being overvalued, usually due to high demand, unusually high levels of investment, and other factors. So even though a lot of people would consider Toronto to be in a housing bubble right now, the Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President for RE/MAX of Ontario Atlantic Canada, that was a mouthful, actually said that he doesn't view the situation as a housing bubble, but rather an affordability crisis. And I honestly have to agree. I think, first of all, addressing the fact that the average selling price of a home, of homes in Toronto was up 14.9% in just 1 year is already crazy to think about. And I think that a lot of the lack of inventory has to do with speculators within the housing market. Before we get into that, Andrea, do you know what speculators are?
People perusing or people browsing, I'm assuming.
Yeah, okay. What do you think they do? Sorry, why do you think that I think that speculators are the reason for the lack of inventory?
I'm assuming
of housing.
I'm assuming because they're the ones that are able to afford places, and when they do find something they buy it up.
Yeah, so what speculators are in the housing market is so they're people who are constantly looking at housing markets, making sure they're constantly looking at the housing market, and when they see houses in good areas that are at low prices, they basically scalp the house and take it off the market so that when the housing market is back at a high, they're able to sell it and basically make money off of the change in the housing market. And so these speculators, I would say that they are hoarders of properties, because it's just a game to them. Like, which property can I buy at a good price so I can make money off of it when I sell it for a higher price? And because these speculators, their goal is to sell when the market is high. COVID being a thing right now has definitely put a dent in their plans because of the mass amounts of layoffs and general job losses and just lockdowns that resulted from the pandemic. The housing market hasn't really been able to be steady enough for these speculators to feel comfortable selling the properties they have. And so what this means, I know, exactly. And so what this means is that a lot of the housing and properties that are off the market is not because they're full.
Shame on them.
But it's because, it's not that they're full, they're in fact empty, but it's because the owners of these properties are being, selfish and they don't want to lose money that they could have gotten for selling the properties at a higher price. But even when the effects of COVID start to slow down and these speculators are able to sell their properties, there still won't be enough relief to meet the demand of affordable housing. But one way that the city of Toronto is addressing the need for affordable housing. So they're aware that there are issues surrounding affordable housing, and they're actually currently developing an inclusionary zoning policy that would require new residential developments to include affordable housing units into the development. And so this means that new developments that are being proposed in the city of Toronto must include a certain percentage of their development to have affordable housing units. And I think this is a really good policy to put in place so that the, like there's a rule to follow. Developers now aren't allowed to create units that are overpriced. And another way that the government is trying to help alleviate affordability issues is by implementing housing policies in their official plan. And these policies are used to protect rental housing from demolition or conversion and secure new affordable housing. And so by protecting these rental houses from demolition, it's a good way to ensure that people who currently live in these units, they won't suddenly be kicked to the curb if things go wrong, because it's basically like an insurance plan. So with that being said, it seems pretty clear that policymakers have a pretty big role in implementing affordable housing.
Yeah, definitely. So thinking about who should take action or who should lead the action in creating affordable housing, the first one is obviously policymakers. And I think when it comes to policymakers, I have like two kind of different people in mind. I have first off like planners, and then second off politicians. So I think I have like city planners in mind because I think one of the biggest issues regarding the lack of supply in Toronto's housing crisis is our zoning regulations. And in order to create more diverse types of housings, we need to open up the single family housing zoning restrictions that are currently in place in most of Toronto. And modifying our zoning regulations will allow for not only greater diversity of housing types, but also a greater price or economic level in the housing types. And just in general, it's like single family housing and apartments are not enough to meet everyone's demands. And the second one is politicians, I think, are the important policymakers to target. And there are a lot of things that they could be doing or they should be doing. And the first one is like creating more affordable units in new housing developments. So it's quite comforting to hear that this is going to be a policy that's implemented in future developments that a percentage of the housing developments need affordable housing included. But I think the bigger issues are things that addresses what are currently, or addresses housing that's currently existing within our, I guess, area. And the first like great idea is like a greater rent control. And unfortunately, with the change in the provincial government in the past couple of years, there's a lot of policies that protected renters that were removed. And one of them is the annual increase. And so previously this was set at 2.2% max per year. However, based on the new guidelines proposed by the provincial government, this max rent increase guideline was removed in 2020 for new units. So every year your landlord could increase by $100 instead of by only 2.2%. So I think the first thing in order to address this kind of affordable housing thing is to put back in place the annual increase control limit.
Do you know why they took that away?
Well, I have my theories of why they took it away, and a lot of them has to do with I guess politics, and these politicians have connections, and a lot of these connections are big landlords who would benefit from not having a rent increase. I mean, not having this restriction in place. Therefore, they can reap more like money.
Wow. Okay. I always knew that there was a cap on rent increases, but I didn't realize it was taken away. So that
So this is like one of the big major things that the Ford government did when they went into office. But like, because this only affects new units, the announcement was quite like dim compared to the many other things that had occurred. Yeah, there's a lot to that.
Wow.
And another thing that I think that would help with the housing or the lack of affordable housing is the prevention of rent evictions. And do you know what rent evictions are?
Honestly, I have no idea. It kind of sounds like rent evictions, but also like it sounds like evictions for renovators. So I have no idea.
Yeah, so it's like you're kind of like on the you're kind of on the way. So rent evictions is when many property owners they decide that, oh, my unit is looking in need of renovations. And in order to make these renovations happen, I need to evict my tenants.
Okay,
And
okay.
a lot of times, because you can't have like renovations occurring within the unit, especially if there are like major changes. So a lot of time, these property owners are found abusing the tenancy laws to easily evict their tenants by claiming the need for renovations, even if it's just like a purely cosmetic thing. It's like, I'm gonna change the kitchen, so I need you to move out so I can change the kitchen, even though it's not a necessity or it's not broken. And this problem is especially prevalent in like both Toronto and the Vancouver area. That the city of New Westminster in British Columbia has actually implemented a bylaw that would prevent that. It was so good at shutting down rent evictions that a developer actually launched a lawsuit challenging it. So like the fact that this bylaw that a city has implemented for themselves is actually working, it's like, wow, wouldn't this be great for the rest of Canada?
Wow. You know, honestly, I
Mm-hmm.
think going on to like why politicians and just general policymakers should have such a
Mm-hmm.
big role in implementing affordable housing and help just basically help help with the issue around affordable housing is that
Mm-hmm.
like if they put the needs of tenants before the need of landlords, so much would be resolved. Like I think right
Mm-hmm.
now, like what you said when you answered my question on why the rent increase was removed was
Mm-hmm.
because or like you assume it's because like there's more money for the landlords and politicians and landlords are like, you know, buddy buddy friends and they want to help their friends.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's definitely not the right way to go about it. Like it doesn't matter
Mm-hmm.
if you're closer to this person over that person.
Mm-hmm.
If your duty is for the people, you fight for the people, not your friends. Like it doesn't matter if
Mm-hmm.
your friends don't like what you're doing. That's not your job to care for your friends. It's to care for the
Yeah.
people. That's literally your job.
Mm-hmm.
You got to do it.
Yeah, unfortunately not everyone goes into politics to serve the
I
people.
know.
Unfortunately, a lot of times they go into politics to serve their own
I
needs.
know and
And sometimes even their own ego.
oh, that is like why are people like this?
Yeah, so I think another thing that I think politicians should be doing is to provide incentives for rent stabilizing units. I think a lot of times in especially in Canadian context, there's a lot of incentives that are given out for first time home buyers
Mm,
or first time people that are trying to look for their first place rather than providing assistance for renters. So like some of these like first time or some of these like major policies that are consistently in favor of home buyers is like the actual first time home buying incentive, which is like a shared equity mortgage with the government of Canada.
mm,
So it's like to buy your first house, like someone is able to help you. However, to look for rent, no one's able to help you but yourself.
mm-hmm.
So I think if we're able to provide incentives to create sort of these rent stabilizing units, it would help a lot in creating more stable housing costs for people in general.
Mm-hmm.
And another one is providing incentives to build good quality social housing.
Mm,
I think a lot of times there is a lot of incentives saying like, oh, if you build an apartment here, I'll give you this land for a discount. However, that's only limited, that is not restricted or like limited to require social housing units or making it fully social housing. So I think if there's more incentives like that, I think there is going to be less of a stigma of social housing, and then with more housing out there, there is greater affordability.
And I think a lot of the points you just said were ways to help after the fact. And I think another way that politicians and policymakers can help before the fact is to implement policies or put a cap on, you know, a way to control the amount of like speculators there are, the amount of foreign investors, overseas investors there are that buy like mass amounts of properties, like, you know, like multiple floors in different condo buildings, just with the sole purpose of renting it out. I think I don't think, even though I'm against it personally, I don't think there is any I don't think there should be a rule on how many properties you own, but I think there should be rules and regulations in place on how you rent out the properties that you own, because if you're able to afford so many properties, you don't need that extra buck or two from the rent you receive from your tenants. Like, I think there should be policies in place to help cap the amount of rent these investors and these property owners charge, so that the tenants aren't being overcharged for units.
And like, similar along those lines, I think something that Toronto needs to implement is a vacancy tax. And a vacancy tax is like when a property that an investor or someone has bought is left empty, there's no tenants they're renting out to, you get taxed. And I think Vancouver has implemented I don't remember or recall what percentage that tax is, but is working really well, that a lot of people are offloading their empty properties. And I think that would be really important for Toronto, because Toronto has a lot of empty Airbnbs that are a lot, like, investors are using their properties as Airbnbs, and currently because of the pandemic it's left empty because no one's coming for tourism.
Wow, okay, yeah, I think that would be a really excellent way to help curb this, and hopefully Toronto catches on and implements it soon.
Yes. Yeah. So a second person of interest I think would be important in taking action for creating affordable housing are developers.
I agree.
And I get that a lot of them come into the business where, like, making money is a priority, but I think, in my opinion, is like, money isn't everything. I think you should like, you're building houses for people, and house is not just a place to live. A house is, a lot of times, it's like home. It has a lot of value, a lot of meaning. It provides a basic necessity. So it's like, I think you should not be looking at the house you create purely in like a money sense, but also like like, I don't, in a nice way, say like, have a heart, grow a conscience, like life is not about making money, especially if the money is made at the expense of another person's livelihood. And I think housing is a huge part of another person's livelihood. Any thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I mean, in my head, I say it nicer, but I agree completely. I think, like, developers definitely have a large role to play in implementing affordable housing, and just to help solve the issues around affordable housing, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are coming up with the new developments that provide the housing. And so they get to choose what type of units to develop. They get to choose, basically, they get to choose their audience for who their units are built for. And I think they need to focus more on the greater good of people. And even with the inclusionary zoning policy that the City of Toronto put in place, or with the housing policies that the City of Toronto put in place with regards to Section 37 of the Planning Act, which, like, the whole thing doesn't have to be affordable housing, but just having certain sections that are affordable they make all the difference. Just having that little bit of change can make such a difference.
And I think, like, when you're developing homes en masse, like you're doing a whole subdivision or a whole apartment, like at some point the money that you're raking in is not because you necessarily need the money, it's more so you want it. So I think when you're in that position or you're in that space, it's like you should start thinking about like who can afford this, who will buy this. It's like not thinking about like who you want to buy this based on what you want to get out of it, but rather thinking of like, yeah, the community as a whole.
And actually, when you put it that way, like, let's think about it like this. If a developer were to develop a whole community of mansions, multi-million-dollar homes, but 2 or 3 of those homes are left vacant and unsold because, you know, no one can afford it. I think the amount of money they lose in that case would so much, like, they would lose so much more money in that case than if they were to have built affordable housing from the start and have all of the units be filled up because people actually want to live there because they can afford it. I mean, I don't know if the math actually adds up, but in my head, that makes sense. I think they shouldn't take that risk in possibly losing out on vacant houses that they develop, and just build houses, build the developments for people who can, for people who need it.
Yeah, like as you mentioned before, like build for your target audience that exists. Don't build for who you want.
Yeah.
Like actually look at in the city like who exists, who is looking for housing, and what can people afford, rather than like what you would like.
Yeah, exactly.
And like I think the last group of people that are important in taking action is obviously citizens. I think a lot of us should get informed. We should speak up, let our local councilors know, and also let our community know what we want and what we need. What is like what kind of housing types we need, what kind of housing pricing we need, and let them know and like be engaged and participate in the town halls to ensure that the city, the province, and the developers are actually held accountable to what they promise or what they say they will do.
And I think on top of that, like, as the public, we actually have so much power in controlling the narrative. I think if we make enough noise about the situations, the current issues at hand, we complain enough about the negative circumstances surrounding the situations, there will be changes made, because that doesn't look good on the politicians, and eventually they will have to make a difference if they want to continue serving the public, because if they don't make changes, they're not going to have the vote for the next time around. And so using your voice is really important, and just stand up for what you believe in. If you think something is wrong, you should always stand up for it. And, you know, we have the ability to help alleviate the issues surrounding affordable housing. And so with all of that being said, I think it's safe to say that was the plan for now. Listen to our next episode to continue figuring it out with us.
Thanks for following along. If you like this episode, please give it a like, a review, subscribe for more. Until then, follow us on Instagram at What's the Plan Podcast for what the next plan is.